January 17, 1945. Northern Luzon, Philippines. The air tasted of ash and copper. In the pre-dawn darkness, 3 Japanese generals stood on the eastern slope of Hill 355, their breath forming pale clouds in the mountain cold. Major General Yamashita's regional command post lay 15 kilometers to the north, but here, on this nameless ridge overlooking the Lingayen Gulf, these officers had gathered to observe what they believed would be a masterpiece of defensive warfare. Below them, concealed in a labyrinth of caves and reinforced tunnels carved into volcanic rock, sat nearly 4,000 Imperial Army soldiers, 200 Type 92 heavy machine guns, and 47 artillery pieces ranging from mountain guns to coastal defense cannons. The general smiled, not the broad, careless smiles of the untested, but the quiet, knowing expressions of men who had studied Iwo Jima's blueprint, who had learned from Paliliu's Cost of American Victory, who understood that every meter of Philippine soil could be purchased in enemy blood. They had reason for confidence. 6 months of labor had transformed this hill into something unprecedented in the Pacific theater, a 3-tiered fortress system where the mountain itself had become a weapon. The Americans were coming. Everyone knew this. The invasion fleet had been spotted days ago, a steel horizon of landing craft and battleships that stretched beyond counting. But the generals had read their history. They knew what had happened to American forces at Tarawa, where a single defended beach had consumed 3,000 casualties in 72 hours. They knew about the Kakaza Ridge on Okinawa, not yet fought but already planned, where similar terrain would bleed the Americans for weeks. And they knew their own mathematical certainty, that each defended cave on Hill 355 would require flamethrowers, satchel charges, and infantry blood to silence. At this rate, at this cost, the Americans would negotiate. They would have to. What the generals did not know, what they could not know as they stood there in the January darkness, watching the first gray light touch the Philippine Sea, was that they were observing the final hours of a military assumption that had shaped Japanese defensive doctrine since Guadalcanal. They did not know that 16 kilometers offshore, floating in the pre-dawn gloom, was an artillery concentration unlike anything that had ever existed in human warfare. They did not know that American industrial capacity had evolved beyond their intelligence estimates, beyond their planning parameters, beyond the very frameworks of possibility that had informed their confident smiles. They did not know that the hill beneath their feet had already been erased from American tactical maps, not because it would be captured, but because by dawn, in any meaningful military sense, it would cease to exist. The American way of war had changed, and these 3 generals, standing on their impregnable mountain, were about to become its first lesson. To understand what happened on Hill 355, one must first understand what the Imperial Japanese Army expected from American forces in early 1945. Their assumptions were not irrational. They were built on 2.5 years of actual combat data, on observed patterns, on the documented behavior of American units, from Guadalcanal to Saipan. The Japanese had studied their enemy with the same meticulous care they brought to all military planning, and they had identified what they believed were immutable characteristics of American tactical doctrine. First, Americans were impatient. They attacked on predictable schedules, pushed for rapid advances, and measured success in terrain captured per day. This impatience could be exploited. A well-prepared defense that slowed American momentum would create political pressure in Washington, would fill hospital ships, would generate newspaper headlines about stalemate and quagmire. Second, Americans were profligate with supporting fire, but conservative with infantry lives. They would shell a position for hours, even days, before sending in ground troops. This pattern was so reliable that Japanese defensive planning could be built around it. Dig deep enough, reinforce thoroughly enough, and you could survive the bombardment, then emerge to slaughter the infantry advance. Third, Americans were logistically dependent. Their modern mechanized military required vast supply chains, constant fuel deliveries, and uninterrupted ammunition flow. Disrupt these, force them to fight in difficult terrain where supply became complicated, and their advantages would diminish. These assumptions had worked. They had worked at Buna, where Australian and American forces took 2 months and 7,000 casualties to capture a coastal swamp. They had worked at Tarawa, where Japanese defenders killed or wounded 3,500 Americans before being annihilated. They had worked at Peleliu, where a garrison of 11,000 Japanese soldiers held an island smaller than Central Park for 2.5 months, inflicting nearly 10,000 American casualties in the process. The doctrine was clear: trade space for time, force the Americans into grinding infantry combat, make every position cost enough blood that eventually, the political will would fracture. Japan could not win a war of movement or industrial production, but a war of attrition, fought on carefully chosen ground, transformed into a test of national resolve. That was different. That was survivable. So the generals on Hill 355 had built their fortress according to proven principles. The main defensive positions were not on the military crest where American naval guns could reach them, but on the reverse slope, shielded by the mountain's bulk. The firing positions were small, offering minimal targets. The connecting tunnels were deep, some more than 30 meters underground, carved through solid rock that could withstand anything but a direct hit from battleship ordnance. And battleship guns, the generals knew, could not be precisely aimed at individual cave mouths. The supply caches were distributed and hidden. The medical stations were underground. Even the water supply had been secured, with natural springs channeled through the cave system. And most importantly, the defense was layered. The Americans would encounter the first line of resistance 1,000 meters from the base of the hill, camouflage pillboxes and spider holes that would force the attacking infantry to deploy, to call for support, to slow down. Behind this tripwire came the main defensive belt, a zone of interlocking machine gun positions where every approach was covered by at least 3 weapons. And finally, at the hill's core, the deep positions where the garrison could retreat, survive, and emerge to counterattack. It was a system designed not to win a single dramatic victory, but to still be fighting 3 weeks later, to still be killing Americans a month later, to transform one hill into a campaign. The generals had calculated the mathematics. For 1,000 defenders with adequate ammunition could hold this position for 40 days against a full American division. 40 days of fighting would generate, conservatively, 8,000 to 10,000 American casualties. Multiply that across every defensive position in Luzon, and the invasion of Japan itself became unthinkable. The atomic bomb did not exist in their calculations. The bomb was still just a theoretical possibility, a rumor in intelligence reports. What existed was this hill, these tunnels, these 4,000 soldiers, and the proven principle that Americans could be bled. So they smiled, and they waited for the dawn. 16 kilometers offshore, a different kind of preparation was underway. The American fire support plan for the Lingayen Gulf landing was not a document. It was a cathedral of mathematics, an orchestrated industrial symphony that had required 3 months of planning and represented the output of factories from Pennsylvania to Oregon. The numbers were staggering. Assembled in the darkness were 6 battleships, 9 cruisers, and 24 destroyers, carrying among them more than 11,000 tons of high-explosive shells. Offshore another 15 kilometers, out of sight beyond the horizon, sat 4 escort carrier groups whose aircraft carried another 2,000 tons of bombs and napalm. And, most critically, most unprecedentedly, distributed among the fleet were 78 specialized fire control vessels equipped with the new Mark 8 fire control radar system, a technology that could aim naval guns with accuracy previously impossible. The Americans had learned their lessons too. At Tarawa, the pre-invasion bombardment had been thunderous but ineffective. The shells, falling without precise aim, had cratered empty beach while leaving the defensive bunkers intact. At Saipan, longer bombardment had helped, but still the infantry had been forced into point-blank combat with positions that should have been neutralized. At Peleliu, the Japanese reverse slope defense had been devastatingly effective precisely because American naval guns could not reach the caves. So American doctrine had evolved. The evolution was not philosophical but technological, not a change in military thinking, but a change in industrial capability. The United States had done something no military power in history had done before. It had applied industrial mass production principles to precision fire support. The Mark 8 radar could track individual targets on a hillside. Forward air controllers with new radio equipment could call a naval gunfire within 3 minutes. Spotter planes equipped with cameras could photograph shell impacts and radio corrections in real time. And most importantly, the Americans had stopped thinking about bombardment as preparation for attack and started thinking about it as attack itself. The plan for Hill 355 reflected this new doctrine. The first phase would last 4 hours, not minutes, hours, and would involve systematic destruction of every observed defensive position, using direct fire from destroyers positioned less than 4 kilometers offshore. The second phase would add cruiser fire, with 8-inch guns targeting the reverse slope positions using indirect fire calculated from aerial photographs. The third phase would introduce the battleships, whose 14 and 16-inch guns would not aim at specific targets, but would systematically destroy the structural integrity of the hill itself, collapsing tunnels through sheer concussive force. And the fourth phase, the final phase, would involve saturation bombing by carrier aircraft, not to destroy what remained but to ignite it, to fill every intact cavity with fire. The planning documents were explicit about the objective. Hill 355 was not to be prepared for assault. It was to be eliminated as a military feature. The Americans would not be sending infantry to capture this hill. They would be sending infantry to occupy what remained of it. At 0427 hours, the fire mission began. The first shells were almost surgical, 5-inch destroyer rounds targeted at identified bunker openings, fired slowly enough that observers could spot the impacts and adjust. This lasted 11 minutes. The Japanese defenders in the forward positions recognized the pattern. This was the expected bombardment, heavy but survivable, something to wait out in the deep shelters before emerging to meet the inevitable infantry assault. Some of the veterans, men who had survived previous bombardments, actually felt relief. This was familiar. This was manageable. Then the cruisers opened fire. The difference was not merely in caliber. The 8-inch guns on American heavy cruisers fired shells weighing 118 kilograms, each one containing nearly 14 kilograms of explosive. But mass alone does not explain what happened. The critical factor was volume and precision. The cruisers were not firing at the hill. They were firing a grid pattern across the hill, systematically walking shells across every square meter of the reverse slope, where Japanese positions had been identified or suspected. And they were doing this not with 1 or 2 guns, but with dozens in a coordinated fire plan, where shells arrived in clusters, where one impact would blast away camouflage and the next would penetrate the exposed position inside the tunnels. The Japanese soldiers experienced something that violated their understanding of bombardment. The concussions were continuous, not the rhythmic pattern of timed salvos, but an unbroken drumbeat of impacts. Dust filled the air until breathing became a conscious effort. The lights, bare bulbs strung along the tunnel ceilings, swung wildly, then went dark as connections shook loose. Men shouted to each other, but could not hear replies over the roar. And then the collapses began. A tunnel does not collapse dramatically. In movies, there's a rumble, a dramatic cave-in, a clear before and after. In reality, a tunnel under sustained bombardment fails gradually and then catastrophically. First come the cracks, small fissures in the rock ceiling that vent dust and tiny stones. Then come the sags, where the weight of the mountain above begins to deform the tunnel profile. Then come the falls, small at first, a cubic meter of rock that can be cleared away. But each fall weakens the structure. Each fall redistributes weight. And when the critical failure comes, it comes all at once. Tons of rock moving in seconds, not filling the tunnel but compressing the air, creating a shock wave that kills by overpressure before the debris arrives. The first tunnel collapse occurred at 0451 hours. 47 men died instantly, crushed or asphyxiated. The second came 3 minutes later, killing another 60. By 0510 hours, 7 of the major tunnel complexes had experienced critical failures, and the survivors, those who had been in tributary passages or secondary chambers when the main tunnels collapsed, found themselves trapped in isolated pockets with no communication, no command structure, and no way to reach their fighting positions. And still the bombardment had not reached its main phase. At 0515 hours, the battleships began firing. There is a qualitative difference between being shelled by a cruiser and being shelled by a battleship. It is the difference between being in an earthquake and being in a collapsing building. A 14-inch shell from a battleship weighs more than 680 kilograms. It arrives at supersonic speed. When it impacts rock, it penetrates 3 to 5 meters before detonating, and the detonation releases the energy equivalent of 250 kilograms of TNT in a confined space. The effect is not merely destructive. It is geological. The battleships firing on Hill 355 were not attempting to hit specific targets. The fire plan divided the hill into zones, and each zone was assigned a specific number of shells. The battleships would fire on each zone until the assigned count was complete, then move to the next zone. No observation, no adjustment, just systematic mechanical destruction, zone by zone, as if the hill were not a military position, but a construction project to be demolished by schedule. The Japanese generals, those 3 officers who had stood on the eastern slope at dawn, were no longer on the slope. They had retreated into the command bunker, the deepest and most reinforced position on the hill, when the cruiser fire had intensified beyond expected parameters. The command bunker was a masterpiece of engineering, 12 meters underground, with a reinforced concrete roof a meter thick, covered by 3 more meters of earth and rock. It had been designed to survive a direct hit from battleship ordnance, and it did survive in a technical sense. The structure did not collapse, but the men inside experienced something that engineering calculations cannot capture. Each battleship impact transmitted a shock wave through the rock, not the airborne shock of a near miss, but a ground-transmitted pulse that traveled to the island basalt structure like a bell being struck. The human body does not process this well. The inner ear evolved to maintain balance in a stable gravitational field, rebels against a world that moves in sudden jolts. Several men vomited. Others experienced disorientation severe enough that they could not stand, and the psychological effect was more devastating than the physical. These were experienced officers who had survived bombardments before, but this was different. This was not combat, but geology, not a military action, but a planetary event. One of the generals, the youngest, a 42-year-old veteran of the China campaigns, kept trying to make calculations. He had been educated at the Imperial Army Academy, had studied engineering before becoming an infantry officer. He tried to count impacts, to estimate tonnage, to make sense of what was happening. But the numbers did not work. The rate of fire was impossible. No fleet could sustain this. No navy had this much ammunition. His training told him that battleship bombardment was powerful but brief, that the ships carried only so many shells, that the expense of 16-inch ammunition meant it would be rationed carefully. He was wrong on every count. The battleships firing on Hill 355 had loaded for exactly this mission. They carried reduced fuel loads to accommodate extra ammunition, and the shells, while expensive by any historical standard, were being expended according to a calculus that measured cost not in dollars, but in American lives. Each shell cost approximately $1,500 to manufacture. The fire plan called for 2,000 battleship shells to be fired at Hill 355, $3 million in ammunition. But $3 million was less, much less, than the calculated cost of treating the casualties that would result from assaulting this position with infantry. The Americans had done the mathematics. The shells were cheaper. By 600 hours, the structural destruction of the hill was complete. The tunnels had collapsed. The bunkers had failed. The carefully prepared defensive positions had ceased to exist as functional military structures. But the Americans were not finished. At 0603 hours, the first wave of carrier aircraft arrived. They carried napalm. Napalm in 1945 was still a relatively new weapon, first used in combat only 2 years earlier. But its effectiveness against fortified positions had been proven repeatedly in the Pacific. The weapon's genius lay not in its temperature. Gasoline fires were not meaningfully hotter than other explosives, but in its behavior. Napalm flowed. It ran into caves, seeped into crevices, followed air passages, and it consumed oxygen, creating a secondary effect where defenders who survived the fire died of asphyxiation. The aircraft made their runs at low altitude, less than 100 meters, dropping their payloads directly onto the hill's surface. The napalm canisters burst on impact, spreading the jellied gasoline across the broken rock, into the crater fields left by the battleship shells, and most critically, into every fissure and crack that led to the surviving underground spaces. Then the ignition charges triggered, and the hill became fire. What the Japanese soldiers experienced in the isolated pockets of the tunnel system cannot be fully documented, because so few survive to describe it. But the physical process is clear. Fire in an enclosed space consumes available oxygen rapidly. The carbon dioxide concentration rises. Breathing becomes difficult, then painful, then impossible. Some men likely attempted to escape, to claw their way through collapsed tunnels toward air. Others likely sat in the darkness and waited, understanding that no help would come, that the American bombardment was not preparation for assault, but assault itself. By 0630 hours, smoke was rising from dozens of fissures across the hill surface. Not the gray-white smoke of dust and explosives, but the thick black smoke of petroleum fire. The hill was not merely damaged. It was burning from within. A geological coal seemed ignited, venting heat and smoke like a dying volcano. At 0645 hours, as the sun cleared the horizon and daylight reached the Lingayen Gulf, the bombardment ceased. The silence was startling. After more than 2 hours of continuous fire, the absence of sound was itself a presence, something that pressed against eardrums. Observer aircraft circled the hill, their cameras recording the results. What had been a forested ridgeline was now a lunar landscape of overlapping craters, smoking fissures, and exposed rock. The vegetation had been stripped away. The topsoil had been redistributed. The military crest of the hill, the high point where the Japanese had positioned observation posts, had been physically lowered by an estimated 6 meters. At 0700 hours, American infantry began their advance toward Hill 355. They encountered no resistance. The transformation this represented was not merely tactical. It was philosophical, an expression of a particular American approach to warfare that the Japanese high command had fundamentally misunderstood. The Japanese had assumed that American material abundance meant American soldiers would be risk-averse, that the availability of firepower would be used to minimize casualties, but that ultimately infantry would still be required, that ground would still be contested. But American doctrine had evolved beyond this. The United States was not using firepower to support infantry. It was using firepower to replace infantry. The calculation was explicit. Every ton of shells fired was measured against every American life it might save. And in 1945, the United States could produce shells, millions of shells, faster than it could train replacement soldiers. The bottleneck was not industrial, but human, so the doctrine adapted. Positions that might have required a week of infantry fighting were simply destroyed. Hills that might have cost hundreds of casualties were erased. The war became, in certain theaters, not a contest between soldiers, but a contest between Japanese defensive engineering and American industrial output. And industrial output was winning. The soldiers who reached Hill 355 on the morning of January 17th found almost no one to fight. The few surviving Japanese soldiers, estimates range from 200 to 300 out of the original 4,000, were not organized, not resisting, not capable of coordinated defense. Most were suffering from shock, from internal injuries caused by overpressure, from carbon monoxide poisoning. Some surrendered, though surrender had been forbidden by Japanese military doctrine. Others simply sat in the wreckage, unresponsive, staring at nothing. A small number attempted to fight. Isolated individuals who emerged from the rubble with rifles or grenades, but they were not defending a position. They were simply ending their lives in a particular way. The American infantry advance across Hill 355 took 4 hours and resulted in 11 American casualties, all minor, mostly from twisted ankles or falls in the crater-torn terrain. The position that 3 Japanese generals had calculated would hold for 40 days had fallen in less than 6 hours from the start bombardment, and the fall had cost American forces fewer casualties than a typical traffic accident. But the significance was not in this single hill. The significance was in what it represented. The systematization of overwhelming force, the industrialization of precision destruction, the application of American manufacturing capacity to the problem of warfare in a way that made traditional defensive doctrine obsolete. The Japanese could dig deeper, could build stronger, could prepare more thoroughly, but none of it mattered if the Americans simply demolished the geography itself. Among the wreckage of the command bunker, American soldiers found the bodies of the 3 generals. The bunker had not collapsed, but all 3 men were dead, apparently from internal injuries sustained during the battleship bombardment. On a small wooden table, preserved by the bunker protection, sat a map of Hill 355 with the defensive positions marked in red ink. The detail was extraordinary. Every bunker, every tunnel, every fire lane carefully noted. It was a map of men who had thought carefully, planned thoroughly, and done everything their military training had taught them to do. The Americans photographed the map for intelligence purposes, then left it there. There was no point in studying it. The defensive positions marked on that map no longer existed. But something else was found in the command bunker, something that would be remembered long after the tactical details were forgotten. A small wooden box containing rice. Not military rations, but good rice, short grain, carefully stored in wax paper. A luxury item that someone, probably the generals, had been saving. For what occasion, no one could say. Perhaps for a celebration after holding the position for a month. Perhaps for a final meal before a last stand. Perhaps simply a reminder of home, of meals and better times. The rice became a symbol in the retelling, though the soldiers who found it thought little of it at the time. But later, in the accounts and histories, it would represent the disconnect, the gap between what the Japanese believed about endurance and discipline and sacrifice, and what the Americans had built in terms of sheer material capacity to destroy. The generals had been saving rice. The Americans had been manufacturing shells. And in that asymmetry lay the outcome of not just this battle, but the entire campaign. In the weeks that followed, American forces advanced across Luzon with shocking speed. Positions that intelligence had estimated would require prolonged siege were destroyed in days. The pattern established at Hill 355 was repeated dozens of times. Systematic bombardment, overwhelming fire concentration, then infantry occupation of terrain that was no longer defensible because it no longer existed as a coherent military feature. Japanese defensive doctrine did not adapt because it could not adapt. The entire system was predicated on certain assumptions about the limits of firepower, about the necessity of infantry combat, about the measurements of will and sacrifice. When those assumptions proved false, when firepower became essentially unlimited and infantry combat became optional, the doctrine did not bend. It shattered. By March, American forces had reached Manila. By July, organized Japanese resistance in Luzon had collapsed. The casualties were not light. Thousands of Americans died in the campaign, but they were dramatically lower than Japanese planning had anticipated. The battles that were supposed to cost 10,000 casualties cost 2,000. The positions that were supposed to hold for weeks fell in days. And the fundamental calculation that had shaped Japanese strategy, that American democracy could not sustain the blood price of conquering defended terrain, proved catastrophically wrong. The Americans could sustain it, not because American soldiers were more willing to die, but because American industry had made their deaths less necessary. Every shell manufactured in Pennsylvania, every radar system assembled in Massachusetts, every carrier aircraft built in California was, in effect, a substitute for an American rifleman. The nation that could outproduce the world in steel and aluminum and explosives could also outproduce the world in the one commodity that mattered most in modern warfare, the ability to destroy enemy positions without placing your own soldiers in direct danger. This was the revolution that the generals on Hill 355 had not understood. They had prepared for a war of wills. They had encountered a war of factories. The rice in the wooden box was found by a 19-year-old private from Ohio, a farm boy who had been drafted in 1943 and had fought across the Pacific. He opened the box, saw the rice, and, according to his later account, felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but a kind of sad recognition. He came from a place where people stored food carefully, where you kept the good ingredients for special occasions, where a box of rice could mean something about hope and preparation, and the belief that tomorrow would come. He took a handful of the rice and put it in his pocket, not as a trophy, not as evidence, but as a reminder, though of what exactly he was not sure. That night, at the temporary camp established near the base of what had been Hill 355, he tried to explain it to his squad mates. They did not understand. What was there to remember? They had won. The hill had fallen. The war was progressing. But the private kept the rice anyway, carried it to the rest of the campaign, brought it home to Ohio when the war ended. Years later, interviewed by a historian researching the Lingayen Gulf landing, he was asked what the rice meant to him. He thought for a long time before answering. It meant they were human, he finally said. They prepared all this, built all that, thought it would matter, and they saved rice. For later, for after, they believed in after. The historian asked if this had changed how he thought about the battle. No, the private said. The battle was necessary, had to be fought. But the rice meant they didn't understand what was coming. They thought it was still the kind of war where you could dig in and hold out, where discipline and preparation and sacrifice would be enough. They didn't know that we decided to just remove the hill. He paused, looking at the small paper envelope where he still kept the rice grains after 50 years. We didn't just have more stuff, he continued. We had so much more stuff that we'd stopped thinking about war the same way. We'd stopped thinking about hills as things to capture. They were just things to erase. And once you can erase hills, once you can just delete terrain from the map, then all the courage in the world doesn't matter. All the tunnels don't matter. The rice doesn't matter. In the final accounting, Hill 355 appears as a footnote in the campaign histories. One position among dozens, one victory among hundreds. The battle merited 3 paragraphs in the official U.S. Army history, a brief mention in Japanese accounts. The 3 generals who died in the command bunker were not named in American records, appear only as casualties in Japanese documents. The hill itself was redesignated with a different number in post-war surveys. Its contours changed enough by the bombardment that the original topographical markers were no longer valid. But in the immediate aftermath, for the soldiers who had participated or witnessed what had happened, Hill 355 meant something more. It was evidence of a transition that was occurring across the Pacific Theater, a transformation in the nature of warfare that would echo through the rest of the 20th century. The age where defensive positions could be held through courage and preparation was ending. The age where firepower could substitute for nearly everything else was beginning. This was not about American soldiers being braver or more skilled. If anything, the transformation reduced the demands placed on individual soldiers. They were asked to occupy terrain, not to seize it at bayonet point. And it was not about Japanese soldiers being less determined. The men who had garrisoned Hill 355 had been willing to die defending it. They had prepared to die defending it. Their willingness had simply become irrelevant in the face of industrial-scale destruction. What it revealed was the power of systematic abundance. The United States had not merely produced more weapons than Japan. Many nations can outproduce their enemies in wartime. The United States had produced so many weapons that it could use them in ways that fundamentally altered military possibility. When shells were scarce, they had to be rationed, fired at specific targets, conserved for crucial moments. When shells were abundant enough to be fired by the thousand at a single hill, they became not precision instruments but geological forces. The hill didn't fall to American firepower. The hill was removed by American firepower. There is a difference. And this difference, this transformation of military action from combat to demolition, carried implications that extended far beyond the tactical. It suggested that modern war between industrially asymmetric powers was not really war in the traditional sense. It was an engineering problem. The side with more factories did not merely have an advantage. It had the ability to change the rules, to make traditional military virtues like courage and defensive preparation largely irrelevant. The Japanese had bet everything on their soldiers' willingness to die. The Americans had bet everything on their factories' capacity to produce. And in 1945, in the Philippines, on a hill that no longer existed in its original form, it became clear which bet would prevail. There is a photograph, taken on January 18th, the day after Hill 355 fell. It shows a group of American soldiers resting on the rubble, eating from ration tins. Behind them, smoke still rises from fissures in the broken rock. One of the soldiers is smiling at the camera, a casual smile, the kind you might offer on a job site after completing a difficult task. There is no tension in the image, no sense of danger or triumph, just exhaustion and relief and the mundane satisfaction of work completed. The photograph is remarkable for what it does not show. There are no visible Japanese fortifications because they have been destroyed beyond recognition. There are no enemy soldiers because the survivors are deeper in the wreckage or have already been processed as prisoners. There is no intact geography, no forest, no vegetation, no topsoil, just broken stone and smoke. The hill has become abstract, a place that exists on maps but no longer resembles anything natural. And the soldiers' expressions, this is what Japanese observers, studying such images later, would find most disturbing, are not the faces of men who have survived a battle. They're the faces of men who have performed a job. The distinction is crucial. Battle implies uncertainty, risk, the possibility of loss. A job implies process, method, an expected outcome that was achieved. These soldiers look the way factory workers look at the end of the shift, tired, ready to move to the next task, confident that the system they are part will continue to function tomorrow as it did today. This was the face of American abundance translated into military terms. Not just the ability to produce more, but the ability to produce so much more that the war itself changed character. The Japanese are prepared for an epic struggle, a test of national wills, a battle where courage and sacrifice will be weighed against each other. They had received something else entirely, a systematic dismantling, an industrial process, a demonstration that in modern warfare between powers at vastly different scales of production, traditional military conflict was being replaced by something more mechanical, the rice in the wooden box, save for a future that never came. The tunnels collapsed by shells that cost more to manufacture than the soldiers firing them earned in a year. The general's confident smiles in the pre-dawn darkness. The hill erased by dawn. These are not symbols of victory and defeat in the conventional sense. They are symbols of transition, from warfare as human struggle to warfare as industrial capacity, from battles decided by valor to battles decided by tonnage, from victory as moral achievement to victory as material inevitability. The sun rose on January 17th, 1945, and illuminated a hill that had ceased to exist as a military position. By sunset, that same sun set on a hill that had ceased to exist as geography. And somewhere in the wreckage, in a bunker that had survived the bombardment but not its occupants, sat a box of rice that would never be eaten, saved by men who had believed that preparation and discipline could withstand any assault. They had been wrong, not because they lacked courage, not because their preparations were inadequate, but because they had prepared for a kind of war that was already obsolete, a war where terrain mattered, where defensive positions could be held, where the calculus of blood and will determine outcomes. The Americans had brought a different war, one where terrain was temporary, where positions were optional, where the calculus was measured in tons of steel delivered to target. And in that new war, the deepest tunnel, the strongest bunker, the most determined garrison, all became equally irrelevant when the mountain itself could be reshaped. This was not the war the generals expected when they smiled in the darkness, but it was the war they received. And by dawn, both the hill and their assumptions about modern warfare were gone, erased by the same industrial force that had turned American factories into the most devastating military instrument in human history. The rice remained, a small box, carefully stored, preserved by chance in a bunker that did not collapse. Evidence that someone had believed in tomorrow, had planned for continuation, had saved something precious for a moment that would never come. In the end, it was not the hill that told the story. It was the rice. The hill was geology, military necessity, a tactical objective captured and forgotten. But the rice was human, a small choice, a modest hope, a belief that planning and preparation and discipline could carry you through to the other side. The Americans had proven otherwise, not through superior courage or better tactics, but through the simple, overwhelming fact of abundance. So many shells that hills could be erased, so much firepower that infantry combat became optional, so much productive capacity that the war itself transformed from struggle into process. 3 generals had smiled at dawn. By sunset, they were dead, their fortress was ruins, and their army's doctrine lay as shattered as the tunnels they had built. The rice sat undisturbed in its wooden box, waiting for a meal that would never be served, while American soldiers ate rations from tins and discussed which hill would be next. This was modern war, not glorious, not epic, just thorough, systematic, and utterly decisive. The age of defensive stands had ended. The age of industrial demolition had begun. And Hill 355, erased by dawn, stood as monument to transition, a place where one kind of warfare died and another was born, where courage met abundance and abundance won, where careful preparation encountered limitless production and discovered that in the calculus of 20th century war, production would always prevail. The sun set on the ruins. Smoke still rose from the broken rock. And somewhere in the darkness, American factories continued their work, producing the shells that would race tomorrow's hills, preparing for battles that were not battles but demonstrations, carrying forward a way of war that had stopped measuring victory in land held or enemies killed, and had started measuring victory in terrain erased and systems destroyed. The generals had not understood this. They had died not understanding it. And the rice they had saved, careful, precious, meant for after, sat in its box, evidence of a kind of war that no longer existed, a war where saving rice for tomorrow made sense, where tomorrow would come, where the hill would still be standing when it did. But that war was over, and the rice, like the hill, like the confident smiles in the pre-dawn darkness, had become a relic of a time before abundance changed everything, before American industry proved that in modern warfare, the side that can afford to delete geography from a map does not fight for hills.